Well, much debate in Parliament this week, and particularly today, about the China Free Trade Agreement. Today we've seen specifically a lot of debate about whether the China Free Trade Agreement, which the government wants to get through Parliament as quickly as possible, but Labor still has some concerns about whether it's any different to the free trade agreements we have with Japan, South Korea, Chile, New Zealand, etc. The government says no, not a cigarette paper's difference. Labor says yes, there is. The Shadow Trade Minister Penny Wong joins me now from Canberra. Thank you for your time this afternoon. So what differences are there under this China Free Trade Agreement to the others?
Well, there are a number of things that we've expressed concern about, and can I start by saying we do recognise that the China Free Trade Agreement will create jobs. What we want is for Australians to have the opportunity to fill those jobs. And in relation to our concerns, what we've said is, look, you've got a situation where this is the only agreement which enables what we call IFAs, investment facilitation agreements, where projects of up to 150 million can have different sorts of rights around the entry of labour. Now, what we want is to ensure that there is mandatory labour market testing in relation to people movement under those agreements. All
right. Well, let's just pause on that before we get to the next one. So,
sure.
At the moment, you can have an investment facilitation agreement even without this China Free Trade Agreement, but they're only for projects over $2 billion.
It's the only.
So this agreement would be those over 150 million. It does significantly lower the threshold. What are you actually calling on here? Would you like to see a different threshold or stick with the $2 billion threshold? What's your position?
Well, look, our preference would be a higher threshold, and we thought $2 billion was appropriate, which was the threshold we had in there. But we are being very responsible about this, David. We've said we recognise the government is not in a position to go back and renegotiate every aspect of this agreement with Beijing. So what we've said is, rather than try and renegotiate, what we would like to do is to build safeguards around the existing agreement. So in respect of IFAs, what we've said is, why don't you say that there are safeguards, that people will be required to offer jobs to Australians first. Why don't we make them mandatory? Why don't we put them in legislation? Because at the moment they're at the discretion of the minister. Now,
well, okay, but according
you'd be unsurprised that we simply don't trust Peter Dutton.
Well, do you trust
as the way through?
Do you trust Jan Adams? She's the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She told the hearing the other day on this. Employers seeking to sponsor an overseas worker under one of these IFAs must demonstrate a labour market need and prove that Australians have been provided first opportunity through labour market testing.
I have a lot of regard for Jan Adams, and I accept that she is expressing the policy position. It is not a policy position that is enshrined in legislation or in regulation. It is a policy position which is at the discretion of the minister. And forgive the Labor Party for saying we don't trust Tony Abbott to keep his promises on this, just as he has broken all his promises, or so many of his promises, to the Australian people.
Okay, but just so people can understand this, because you're saying it's not there, the government's saying it is there, the requirement for labour market testing. What's the reality of this? Is it at the department's discretion as to whether there is labour market testing, or is it the point at which, along the timeline, that labour market testing occurs?
Okay, so if I can go through this sequentially, because I think you interrupted me at one point. In relation to the IFAs, it is what I would describe as discretionary, because it is not mandated, it is not required in legislation, and the Labor Party is not going to take Tony Abbott on trust on this. So we want to have a stronger safeguard when it comes to Australian jobs. I would also make the point the government has given away labour market testing under Chapter 10 of the agreement, different stream or different circumstances. And what we want to make sure is that there are safeguards there which minimise or avoid the exploitation of workers, avoids the exploitation of overseas workers, and also that Australian wages and conditions are protected.
But just on that one, I want to get a bit detailed here, and hopefully everyone can keep up with this. Under that stream, this Chapter 10 stream you're talking about, it is only, as I understand it, 5 categories that we're talking about here where labour market testing is removed: business visitors, intra-corporate transferees, independent executives and so on. Are you worried that these...
Don't do the so on.
Okay,
no,
the so on is
where the problem
contractual
is.
service suppliers and installers, independent executives. So which one are you concerned about there, the contractual service suppliers?
The concern that we have is that the government has included in that stream tradespeople. Now that is a much lower level.
Well, I don't see that in this list.
Well, I'm sorry?
Tradespeople are in this list.
I didn't hear that.
I'm just saying I can't see tradespeople in this list.
They are included in that aspect of the agreement. It goes down to trades, technical and professional occupations. So my point about that is we have raised concerns about this before. This is a difference between the Labor Party and the government. We did not remove labour market testing in relation to tradespeople in other agreements. The government has chosen to do that in these North Asian agreements.
So that's my point here. This is the same as the Korea and Japan one, this aspect of it, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it is. It is. And we had.
So why are you worried about
this,
but not Japan and Korea?
Well, I just answered that. I said, and we raised concerns about this specific aspect in relation to Korea and Japan. But neither Korea and Japan have the $150 million projects that you and I have been discussing. I would like to make a point also. There are two things that have happened today. You've asked me on one of them, as you should. Andrew Roberts said there's no difference between this agreement and other agreements. I think we've demonstrated that's not the case. But also, he said to your colleague earlier today and again in the House of Representatives that yes, it is possible for there to be legislative safeguards around such as Labor is suggesting. Now, really, that's quite an admission by the Minister, because what he's saying is what Labor is suggesting can be done. The only reason, David, it can't be done at the moment is because Tony Abbott doesn't want it done.
The argument
he wants a fight. He wants to be a partisan brawler, not a Prime Minister.
Well, the argument Andrew Robb put on that, I think, was that it would upset China. It might embarrass them somehow. I mean, do you accept that?
Well, we are working very hard to put a constructive approach here. We have said for some time now we want to find a way through. I would have thought that is the opposite of trying to embarrass China. The people who are not trying to find a way through, or the person who is not trying to find a way through, is Tony Abbott. He thinks it's in his political interest to have a fight.
Okay,
there's a national interest issue here too.
All right, I'm trying to stick to the details of what's wrong with this and how it can be fixed. Would you ultimately like to see labour market testing for all foreign workers that come in under the 457 visa program? Because apparently only, about 84% of the 457 visa holders aren't labour market tested. So would you ultimately like to see all of them labour market tested?
Well, look, I mean, that's a separate question, probably a question, frankly, for our immigration spokesperson.
Well, it's pretty relevant, though, isn't it, to this whole debate?
But it is, as I was about to say. But I think the principle is this. Australians have, in general, been supportive of trade liberalisation because they understand, just as Labor has advocated for decades, that freer trade means more jobs and better working conditions. But you need to ensure that the economic benefit of trade agreements does flow to Australians through more jobs and better working conditions and higher living standards. Now, when it comes to our labour market, the way you ensure that happens is to make sure that where that's needed, that you have the system that ensures Australians get the opportunity to fill jobs which are created.
So, again, why not roll out this labour market testing to all 457s, if that's your view?
What I was about to say was there may be parts of the labour market where you might not require that. So, for example, business executives. I think there would be a reasonable proposition that you don't really need to have labour market testing there. They're very specialised positions. They might be people who have particular sets of skills. Intra-corporate transferees, people who are within companies moving from one place on the globe to another, in a globalised economy. I'd accept that you wouldn't require labour market testing there. So we're sensible about this. I think the tradespeople, particularly at a time we've got unemployment where it is above 6%, where you've got a decline in manufacturing with the pressure on those areas, and where as an economy we do need advanced technical and manufacturing skills to be maintained in Australia. I think there's an economic argument that you want to ensure that you enable those people to fill jobs which are created by more trade.
Last one on the free trade agreement. If you don't get the change you're talking about here, this legislated commitment for the mandatory for labour market testing, would you actually vote against the free trade agreement itself? You know, you've got Bob Hawke, you've got Bob Carr, all these other Labor leaders saying we've got to have this thing. Would you actually be prepared to vote against it, or would you say, you know, we'll fix this in government?
Well, what I would say is we will continue to press our case to the Australian people, through the media, that the Prime Minister should sit down with us. I mean, it's not in the nation's interest. But you wouldn't hold up this trade deal going through? Well, the person who is the risk to the effective implementation of the China Free Trade Agreement is one Tony Abbott.
Well, a risk to the trade deal going through if this isn't solved is what you're saying?
The only person who is a risk to the implementation of the China Free Trade Agreement is Tony Abbott. So the question,
but with respect, that doesn't answer the question. Would you actually vote down the trade deal?
Well, I'm going to continue to press our position. I think it is a reasonable position, and I'd say to members of the Liberal Party, your Prime Minister should stop behaving like a partisan brawler, and he should sit down with us. Do what John Howard did. I mean, John Howard sat down with, agreed with Mark Latham changes to enable the US FTA to proceed. Let's remember that. At the moment, we've got Bill Shorten showing leadership. I'm prepared to do this, but we need these things because we want to protect the rights of Australians, the opportunity of Australians to fill these jobs, and we've got Tony Abbott saying go away.
Let me ask you on moving on from the free trade